This story is based on true events. I've been a trucker for over 20 years. I've driven thousands of miles, watched the sun rise and set on deserted highways, and I know every pothole on the roads like the back of my hand. I've hauled everything from heavy loads to cargo that, let's just say, wasn't exactly legal. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that cursed night on Route 319. It was a winter night. The sky was starless, covered by a thick layer of clouds that threatened an impending storm. The air was icy, almost cutting, and the road stretched out before me like a black, endless river. I had left Porto Velho, heading to Manaus, with a load of construction materials. I knew this was a tricky route, especially at night. Route 319 is notorious for being one of the most dangerous roads in Brazil, isolated and poorly maintained, but I had made this trip many times and saw no reason for concern. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The hum of the engine was almost soothing, and the rhythmic swaying of the truck on the uneven pavement kept me alert, but not overly so. I was used to this. The loneliness of the road was a familiar companion, but as the night deepened, something changed. It was subtle at first, a feeling of unease that settled in my gut, a growing sense that something wasn't right. The road, already dark, seemed to become even darker, as if the shadows were thickening around me. My headlights barely seemed to penetrate the gloom, and the usual comforting sounds of the engine and tires on the road began to feel oppressive, like a droning noise that filled the cab and pressed in on my thoughts. Then, around midnight, I noticed something odd. My GPS flickered and went blank, a brief glitch that I dismissed as a technical hiccup. But it didn't come back. I tapped the screen, fiddled with the buttons, but nothing worked. I still knew the route, but without the GPS, the reality of how isolated I was began to sink in. There was no signal on my phone either, just an endless no service displayed on the screen. Despite the growing anxiety gnawing at me, I kept driving. Stopping in the middle of nowhere was not an option. The road was rough, full of deep potholes and stretches of muddy terrain that slowed my progress. I pushed on, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No other vehicles, no lights from distant houses, just the darkness pressing in from all sides. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light of my high beams. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was standing still, too still, almost unnaturally so, facing away from me. His clothes were old, tattered, and drenched from the light rain that had started to fall. Something about him sent a chill down my spine. I slowed the truck, unsure of what to do. It's not uncommon to see hitchhikers or stranded travelers on this route, but this man, something was off. The way he stood, completely motionless, as if he didn't even notice my truck approaching. I rolled down the window slightly and called out to him, but he didn't respond, didn't move at all. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep driving, to leave this man behind and not look back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he was in trouble, that I couldn't just leave him there in the middle of nowhere. I brought the truck to a stop a few meters ahead of him, keeping the engine running, and waited, watching him in the rearview mirror. He didn't move. The rain was coming down harder now, and I could see it dripping off his clothes, but he stood there as if he didn't feel it. My hand hovered over the door handle, hesitating. I was torn between the urge to help and the overwhelming sense of dread that told me to stay in the truck. Before I could make a decision, he turned. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned to face me, and that's when I saw his face. Pale, expressionless, with eyes that seemed hollow, as if they were looking right through me. He didn't blink, didn't react to the rain or the truck's headlights shining directly at him. He just stared. I froze. There was something in those eyes, something that wasn't human. It was like staring into a void, a bottomless pit that threatened to swallow me whole. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I knew, deep in my gut, that I had made a mistake by stopping. Without thinking, I slammed the truck into gear and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see if he was still standing there, or worse, if he was following me. The road ahead blurred as I pushed the truck faster, the rain now pouring down in sheets, obscuring my vision. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed the moment I saw that man. The sense of being watched, of not being alone on that deserted road, clung to me like a second skin. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. A shadow moving along the side of the road, keeping pace with my truck. I floored the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest, but the shadow stayed with me, always just at the edge of my vision. My hands were trembling on the wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. It couldn't be. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the road widened slightly, and I pulled over, my entire body shaking. The shadow was gone, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm my racing heart, to convince myself that it had all been in my head, a trick of the dark and the rain. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that what I had seen was real, and that whatever it wasn't finished with me. I was still miles away from Manaus, and the worst was yet to come. The clearing provided a brief respite, but as I sat there, trying to regain my composure, the sense of dread only deepened. The rain was pounding on the roof of the truck, and the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, staring out into the night. I knew I couldn't stay there. The road to Manaus was still long, and sitting in that clearing wouldn't make the distance any shorter. But the thought of getting back on the road, of facing whatever was out there, filled me with a terror I had never felt before. I considered waiting until daylight, but the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There would be no daylight. The storm clouds were too thick, the rain too relentless. Dawn felt like a distant memory, something that might never come. So, with a deep breath, I started the engine again, and the truck rumbled to life. I forced myself to focus on the road ahead, telling myself that I just needed to keep driving, that I could make it through the night. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the fear wouldn't let go. As I pulled back onto the highway, the darkness seemed even more oppressive. The rain had turned the road into a slick, treacherous path, and I had to concentrate to keep the truck from slipping. The trees on either side of the road loomed like giant shadows, their branches swaying in the wind, creating the illusion of movement just beyond the edge of the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was all in my head, I heard it, a faint tapping on the side of the truck. At first, I thought it was the rain, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was coming from the passenger side, near the rear of the truck. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the side mirror, but the rain was too heavy, and I couldn't see anything. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I was miles from any town, on a road that was practically abandoned at this time of night. No one should be out here, especially in this weather. I slowed the truck, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that noise. And then, for just a second, I saw it, a pale face, pressed against the window of the passenger door. It was the same face I had seen earlier on the side of the road, but now it was twisted into a grotesque grin, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I screamed, jerking the wheel in panic, and the truck swerved violently, skidding on the wet road. The face vanished, but the tapping continued, now coming from all around the truck, as if I was surrounded. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt, my heart racing out of control. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of the rain. I sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look out the windows, fearing what I might see. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that dark, rain-soaked night. But eventually, I forced myself to move, to reach for the door handle. I had to know if there was someone, or something, out there. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the rain. The cold, wet air hit me like a slap in the face, but I barely noticed. My eyes scanned the area around the truck, searching for any sign of the figure I had seen. But there was nothing, just the rain and the darkness, stretching out in every direction. The road behind me was empty, as was the road ahead. The tapping had stopped, and there was no sign of the face that had stared back at me through the window. But as I stood there, drenched and shivering, I noticed something strange. The ground around the truck was covered in footprints, bare, human footprints, leading away from the truck and disappearing into the trees. They were fresh, the mud still wet where the feet had pressed into the earth, and there were so many of them, far more than one person could have made. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that whatever had been tapping on the truck wasn't alone. I wasn't alone. Panic gripped me, and I scrambled back into the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition, but when the engine finally roared to life, I floored the accelerator, desperate to get as far away from that PLA. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the rain never letting up, the darkness closing in around me. But I kept driving, pushing the truck faster and faster, not caring about the slick road or the danger of losing control. All I could think about was getting away, putting as much distance between me and whatever was out there. But no matter how far I drove, the fear stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. And every now and then I would catch a glimpse of something in the mirrors, a shadow flitting between the trees, a face just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. By the time I reached Manaus, the rain had finally stopped, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. But the relief I expected to feel never came. The fear, the sense of being hunted, lingered like a dark cloud over me. I parked the truck in the yard, too exhausted to even think about unloading the cargo. My hands were still trembling, my body drained of all energy. I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no explanation, no way to rationalize what I had seen and felt. All I knew was that something was out there on Route 319, something that didn't belong in this world. And I knew that no matter how hard I tried to forget, no matter how much distance I put between myself and that night, it would always be with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next time I dared to drive that road. This story is based on true events. Being a trucker is more than just a job. It's a lifestyle. You live on the road, your truck becomes your home, and the miles you cover define your days. I've been driving for nearly 30 years, and I've seen it all. Storms, breakdowns, near misses, and everything in between. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened that night on Route 232. It was early December, and I was on a tight schedule. My route took me from Recife to Petrolina, a stretch of road I knew like the back of my hand. The highway is long, cutting through miles of dry, desolate landscape, with few towns or even gas stations along the way. I'd driven it more times than I could count, but that night, something was different. I had just loaded up a shipment of electronics and was eager to make good time. The forecast had warned of a cold front moving in, but as I left Recife, the sky was clear and the temperature was mild. I figured I could outrun the worst of the weather if I pushed hard enough. The first few hours passed without incident. The road was quiet, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires on asphalt my only companions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a thin layer of fog began to settle over the road, not uncommon in these parts, especially as the night cooled. But this fog was different, thicker, almost alive, creeping in from the edges of the road like a silent predator. I didn't think much of it at first. Fog was something I could handle, but as it thickened, I found myself slowing down, my high beams cutting through the murk with little effect. The road ahead became harder to see, the world outside my truck narrowing to a claustrophobic tunnel of grey. That's when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. My radio, which had been playing a local station, began to cut in and out, the static growing louder until it drowned out the music entirely. I tried adjusting the dial, but all I got was more static, punctuated by brief, unintelligible bursts of sound, like voices, but distorted, twisted into something unnatural. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off, chalking it up to atmospheric interference. I turned off the radio and drove in silence, trying to focus on the road. But the fog continued to thicken, so dense now that I could barely see the lines on the pavement. I reduced my speed, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Then, through the haze, I saw something up ahead, faint, distant, but unmistakable. A light, small and flickering, like a lantern swaying in the wind. As I got closer, I realized it was moving, weaving slowly back and forth, coming toward me. My first thought was that it was another vehicle, maybe a car with a headlight out, or even someone walking along the road with a flashlight. I slowed down even more, straining to see through the fog. The light drew nearer, and I could make out the silhouette of a figure, walking in the middle of the road, holding what looked like an old-fashioned lantern. Something about the way they moved sent a chill through me. Slow, deliberate, almost too smooth, like they were gliding rather than walking. As I approached, I leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The figure was small, hunched over, and covered in what seemed to be a long, tattered coat. I couldn't see their face, just the dim glow of the lantern and the vague outline of their body. I had no choice but to stop. They were directly in my path, and the fog was too thick to swerve around them safely. I brought the truck to a halt and waited, watching as the figure slowly approached. My heart was pounding, an inexplicable sense of dread welling up inside me. When they were only a few feet from the front of the truck, they stopped. The lantern's light flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the road. I couldn't take my eyes off them, even though every instinct screamed at me to hit the gas and get out of there. Then, slowly, they lifted their head, and I saw their face. Or rather, the lack of it. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to suck in the light around it. The lantern dangled from their hand, swaying gently, and in that moment, I realized something was very, very wrong. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, staring at that faceless figure. It felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. And then, without warning, they began to move again, not toward the truck, but around it, gliding silently past the driver's side door. My breath caught in my throat as I lost sight of them in the fog. I craned my neck to look in the side mirror, but the mist was so thick that I could barely see the back of the truck. Panic set in. Where had they gone? What were they? I was about to throw the truck into gear and floor it when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping on the passenger window. My blood ran cold. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I forced myself to look, even though every fiber of my being told me not to. And there, pressed against the glass, was a hand, pale, thin, with long, bony fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly far. The hand was splayed flat against the window, and though I couldn't see the face that should have accompanied it, I knew it was watching me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The world outside the truck had dissolved into a nightmare of fog and shadows, and all that existed was that hand, tapping softly on the glass. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I couldn't let it in. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed my foot on the accelerator. The truck roared to life, the tires spinning on the wet pavement before finding traction. The hand slid off the window as I lurched forward, the tapping fading into the distance as I sped down the road. But the fog didn't let up. If anything, it grew thicker, wrapping around the truck like a living thing, distorting the road and warping the world outside. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and every shadow, every flicker of light in the mist, sent waves of terror through me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. The road became clearer, the shadows retreating as the headlights cut through the thinning mist. I didn't slow down, not until I was sure that whatever it was had been left far behind. By the time I reached the next town, the fog had completely disappeared, as if it had never been there. I pulled into a truck stop, my hands still shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I parked the truck and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. But there was no rational explanation. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. It wasn't just fog or a trick of the light. There was something on that road, something that shouldn't have been there. I didn't finish the route that night. I called the dispatcher, made up some excuse about a mechanical issue, and took a different road back. I've driven many miles since then, but I've never gone back to Route 232. Whatever it was, I don't want to see it again, and I hope to God that I never do. After that night on Route 232, I swore I would never drive that stretch of road again. But as the months passed, the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the daily grind of life on the road. I convinced myself that it had all been in my head, a result of fatigue, fog, and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. It wasn't until nearly a year later that I found myself back in the same region. I had picked up a load in Fortaleza, bound for Salvador, and the quickest route, unfortunately, took me dangerously close to Route 232. I avoided it for as long as I could, taking detours that added hours to my trip. But as the night wore on and the roads became more and more isolated, I realized that I was running out of options. I would have to pass through at least a portion of Route 232. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I had a delivery deadline to meet, and I couldn't afford to lose any more time. So, with a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, I turned onto the road that had haunted my nightmares for nearly a year. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was quiet, the night clear, with no sign of the fog that had enveloped me the last time. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. Maybe it really had all been in my head. But then, as I rounded a bend in the road, the familiar sight of fog began to creep in. It was faint at first, just a thin layer clinging to the ground, but it quickly began to thicken, swirling around the truck like smoke. My heart started to race. The memories of that night came flooding back, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. I tried to tell myself to keep calm, to focus on the road, but the fog continued to thicken, just as it had before. The road ahead disappeared into a wall of grey, and I was forced to slow down, the truck crawling along at a snail's pace. My headlights were useless against the dense mist, and I strained to see the lines on the road, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, out of the fog, I saw it. Another light, small and flickering, moving toward me. My blood ran cold. It was the same light, the same lantern swaying in the dark, just like before. My heart pounded in my chest as I brought the truck to a stop. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying what I was seeing. The figure was back, moving slowly toward me, the faint glow of the lantern casting eerie shadows in the fog. This time, I didn't wait. I threw the truck into reverse, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that figure as possible. But as I looked in the side mirror, my blood ran cold. There, in the fog behind me, were more lights, dozens of them, flickering like ghostly candles, all moving toward the truck. Panic gripped me, and I slammed on the brakes, my mind racing. I was surrounded. There was no way out. The lights were closing in from all sides, the fog swallowing the road ahead and behind. I was trapped. I didn't know what to do. The only thought in my mind was that I had to get away, had to escape whatever was out there. I shifted the truck back into drive and floored the accelerator, the engine roaring to life as I sped forward into the unknown. The lights continued to close in, and as I drove, I could see them in the mirrors, growing closer, their flickering glow like 1,000 eyes watching me. I could feel the presence of something in the fog, something malevolent, and it was coming for me. The truck barreled down the road, the tires screeching as I took the bends too fast, the fog swirling around me like a living thing. The lights were right behind me now, almost close enough to touch, and I could feel the weight of their gaze, the oppressive presence of something that shouldn't exist. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to lift. The lights faded, retreating into the shadows as the road became clear again. I didn't slow down, not until I was sure I was far enough away. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I finally dared to look in the mirrors, the road behind me was empty. The lights were gone, the fog had lifted, and the night was clear once again. But I knew that whatever it was, it hadn't gone away. It was still out there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached a truck stop miles away. I parked the truck, climbed out, and collapsed onto the pavement, my body trembling, my mind reeling. I had survived, but just barely, and I knew, without a doubt, that I would never ever drive Route 232 again. Whatever haunted that road, whatever malevolent force lurked in the fog, it had let me go, for now. But I knew that if I ever went back, it wouldn't be so merciful. It would be waiting, ready to finish what it had started. And so I stayed away, avoiding that cursed road like the plague, refusing any job that would take me near it. I've driven thousands of miles since that night, seen things that defy explanation, but nothing compares to the terror of that fog, those lights, and the thing that waits in the shadows of Route 232. Some nights, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I can still see them, those flickering lights, moving through the mist, searching for something. Searching for me. This story is based on true events. I've always considered myself a man of reason. 35 years on the road, driving trucks through every kind of weather and terrain imaginable, has taught me to trust what I see and to rely on my instincts. But there are things that happen out there on the road, things that defy logic, things that crawl under your skin and stay with you long after the journey is over. This story is one of those things. It was late November, and I had just finished a long haul from Monterey to Oaxaca. My rig, a worn but reliable freightliner, had seen better days, but she and I had been through enough together that I trusted her to get me through just about anything. The route took me through the Sierra Negra, a remote and rugged mountain range notorious for its treacherous roads and unpredictable weather. I'd driven through those mountains before, but always during the day. This time I was running late, and as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, I knew I was in for a long night. The road through the Sierra Negra is narrow, with steep drop-offs and hairpin turns that make even the most experienced drivers white-knuckled. The locals have all kinds of stories about the place. Ghosts, witches, even tales of ancient, forgotten gods that still roam the forests. I've heard them all at truck stops over coffee and cigarettes, but I've always taken them with a grain of salt. After all, every region has its folklore. The first sign that something was wrong came about an hour into the drive. The sun had completely disappeared, leaving the mountains shrouded in darkness. My headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the winding road ahead, but the light seemed to be swallowed up by the night, barely reaching a few feet in front of me. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves in the wind, were absent, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I tried to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. The Sierra Negra was known for its eerie atmosphere at night. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I turned on the radio, hoping to find some music to break the silence, but all I got was static. No surprise, given the remoteness of the area, but it didn't help my nerves. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was just a flicker, a shadow at the edge of my headlights, but it was enough to make me sit up straighter, my hands tightening on the wheel. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to convince myself that it was just a deer or maybe a stray dog, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadow had moved too fast, too fluidly, to be any kind of animal. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, the road straightened out for a few hundred meters, giving me a clear view of what lay ahead. That's when I saw them, figures standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. They were tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that made my stomach churn. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, God, their eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to suck in the light. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt mere feet from the figures. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The figures didn't move, didn't react to the truck or the noise. They just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I don't know how long I sat there, staring back at them, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, my instincts kicked in, and I reached for the gear shift, ready to throw the truck into reverse and get the hell out of there. But before I could, the figures began to move. It wasn't a normal movement. There was something wrong about it, something broken. Their limbs jerked and twitched as if they were marionettes being controlled by invisible strings, moving in fits and starts that made my skin crawl. They began to walk toward the truck, their long arms reaching out, fingers like claws scraping against the metal of the cab. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The engine roared to life, and the truck lurched forward, barreling through the figures with a sickening thud. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, but I didn't slow down. The adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me going, even as my hands trembled on the wheel. It wasn't until I was well past the worst of the mountain roads that I finally dared to look in the mirrors. There was nothing behind me, just the dark, empty road disappearing into the night. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, but the relief was short-lived. My mind kept replaying the image of those figures, those unnatural movements, those empty eyes. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew something had been out there on that road. I reached a small town just before dawn, pulling into the first truck stop I could find. I parked the rig and stumbled out, my legs shaking, my head spinning. I needed to get out of the truck, needed to feel the solid ground beneath my feet. The truck stop was quiet, only a few other rigs parked in the lot, their drivers asleep in the cabs. I walked around the truck, trying to clear my head, but the unease wouldn't leave me. It was as if the shadows of the Sierra Negra had followed me, clinging to my skin, to my soul. I stopped at the back of the truck, leaning against the trailer, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I'd be driving through the Sierra Negra at night. A part of me hesitated, a gnawing sense of unease that I quickly dismissed. I was a seasoned trucker. What could possibly go wrong? The first hour passed without incident. The road was winding and narrow, the kind that makes your knuckles turn white as you grip the wheel, but I took it slow, making sure to stay in control. The trees lining the road were dense, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light the moon offered. The only illumination came from my headlights, carving weak tunnels through the oppressive darkness. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the road seemed to close in on me, the trees growing thicker and the air colder. The temperature dropped sharply, and soon a heavy fog began to roll in, blanketing the road in a thick white shroud. I slowed to a crawl, my breath fogging up the windshield as I peered into the gloom, searching for the next curve in the road. That's when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. It was just a flash at first, a fleeting glimpse of movement in the trees to my right. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively eased off the accelerator. My eyes scanned the roadside, but there was nothing, just the fog and the trees, silent and still. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, or maybe a coyote. But then I saw it again. This time it was clearer, a figure, pale and indistinct, moving slowly through the fog, parallel to the road. My pulse quickened as I leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far, moving in an almost mechanical fashion. I blinked, and just like that, it was gone, swallowed by the fog. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the mountain air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me. I pressed on, my eyes darting from the road to the trees, every shadow and flicker of movement sending a fresh wave of fear through me. And then the radio cut out. The silence was sudden and jarring. 1 minute, I had the comforting sound of a local station playing old rancheras, and the next, nothing but static. I reached for the dial, twisting it back and forth, but all I got was that unsettling hiss, like 1,000 whispers in the dark. I turned the radio off, but the silence was even worse. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, amplifying every creak of the truck, every bump in the road. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, the fog thickened even more, reducing my visibility to almost nothing. I could barely see the edge of the road, and the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I knew I had to stop. There was no way I could keep driving in this, not without risking a deadly plunge off the side of the mountain. I found a small clearing just wide enough to pull over and park the truck, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. The fog swirled around the beams of light, creating eerie, shifting patterns in the air. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, barely visible through the fog. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was closer now, its long, spindly limbs hanging at odd angles, its head tilted to one side as if it was trying to see me better. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there, but something held me in place, a paralyzing fear that rooted me to the spot. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that fog-shrouded nightmare. But eventually, the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, taking one step after another toward the truck. I snapped out of my trance and reached for the door handle, my hands trembling so badly that I could barely grip it. I fumbled with the lock, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the figure drew closer, its face, or what passed for a face, coming into view. It was featureless, smooth and white, like a porcelain mask with no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just an empty void where a face should be. Panic surged through me, and I finally managed to yank the door open. I stumbled out of the truck, the cold air hitting me like a wall, and started to run. I didn't know where I was going, just away, as far from that thing as possible. My boots pounded against the asphalt, the fog swallowing me up as I fled into the darkness. But the further I ran, the thicker the fog became, until I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless loop of grey and black, with no sign of the truck, no sign of anything. I could hear my own breath, harsh and ragged, echoing in my ears, and the sound of my footsteps, muffled by the fog. And then, somewhere in the distance, I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my own. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the swirling fog and the oppressive darkness. But I knew, somehow, that it was still following me, that it hadn't stopped. My heart raced, and I picked up the pace, my legs burning with the effort. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps behind me never wavered, never slowed. They were always there, just out of sight, keeping pace with me as I fled through the night. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it, a faint light in the distance, cutting through the fog like a beacon. I stumbled toward it, hope flaring in my chest. As I got closer, I realized it was a small roadside chapel, its weathered walls illuminated by a single flickering lantern hanging by the door. I burst through the door and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The inside of the chapel was dimly lit, the walls lined with flickering candles and faded images of saints. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a sharp contrast to the cold, damp air outside. But the footsteps, they had stopped. The silence was deafening, but this time it was a relief. I sat there for a long time, waiting for my heart to stop racing, for the fear to subside. But even as I tried to calm myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beyond the walls of the chapel. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I needed to get back to the truck, to get off that cursed road before whatever was out there found me again. I pushed open the door, half expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting. But the fog had lifted, and the road was empty, bathed in the faint light of the approaching dawn. I made my way back to the truck, my legs trembling with each step. When I reached it, I was relieved to find that everything was as I had left it, the engine still running, the headlights still on. I climbed into the cab and slammed the door shut, locking it for good measure. But as I sat there, trying to steady my nerves, I noticed something on the windshield, a handprint smeared across the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand against it, trying to peer inside. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the glass. The handprint was cold, impossibly cold, as if it had been left by something that didn't belong in this world. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing, before finally wiping it away with the sleeve of my jacket. I didn't waste any more time. I put the truck in gear and drove, not caring how fast or how reckless I was being. I just needed to get away, to leave that place behind. By the time I reached the next town, the sun had risen, casting long shadows across the road. I parked the truck at a rest stop and sat there, my hands still shaking, my mind reeling from what I had experienced. I never spoke about that night to anyone. Who would believe me, anyway? But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. There was something out there in the Sierra Negra, something that defied explanation, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. And no matter how far I drove, how many miles I put between myself and that cursed road, I knew that it was still out there, waiting for the next time I was foolish enough to return. I thought I could forget about what happened in the Sierra Negra. I thought I could put it behind me, chalk it up to fatigue and the tricks of an overworked mind. But some things don't let go that easily. Some things stay with you, haunting your dreams, lurking in the corners of your vision, waiting for the right moment to resurface. 4 months, I avoided that route. I took jobs that kept me far from the Sierra Negra, even if it meant longer hauls or less pay. The other drivers noticed, of course. They joked about how I'd gone soft, how I was scared of a little fog. I laughed along with them, but inside, I was terrified. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and I wasn't about to tempt fate by going back. But then came the night I had no choice. It was late spring, and the company was short on drivers. They offered me a big payout to take a load down to Oaxaca, and despite my better judgment, I agreed. The money was too good to pass up, and I convinced myself that it would be different this time. It was just one trip, just one more drive through the mountains. What were the chances of something happening again? The journey started off without incident. The roads were clear, the weather was mild, and the truck was running smoothly. But as I approached the Sierra Negra, that familiar sense of dread began to creep in. The sky darkened, and the air grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. And then, just like before, the fog rolled in. It came out of nowhere, thick and suffocating, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. The road ahead disappeared into a wall of white, and I felt that same, gnawing fear clawing at my insides. I tried to push it down, to focus on the road, but the memories of that night came rushing back. The figure in the fog, the handprint on the windshield, the feeling of being watched. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the fog grew thicker, the road more treacherous. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I told myself it was just fog, just like any other night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And then, the radio cut out. The sudden silence was like a punch to the gut. I reached for the dial, my hands trembling, but all I got was static. The same static as before, that unsettling hiss that filled the cab, like whispers in the dark. I turned the radio off, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw it, the figure standing in the middle of the road. My blood ran cold. It was the same figure, tall and pale, with those impossibly long limbs and that featureless face. It was closer this time, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it was listening to something only it could hear. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. For a moment, everything was still. The fog hung in the air, thick and oppressive, the figure standing motionless in the beams of the headlights. And then, slowly, it began to move. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements smooth and unnatural, as if it wasn't bound by the same laws of physics as the rest of us. It drifted toward the truck, its limbs hanging at odd angles, its head still tilted in that eerie, listening pose. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as it came closer and closer, until it was standing right in front of the truck, its blank face inches from the windshield. And then it spoke. The voice was a low, guttural whisper, like the sound of wind howling through the trees, like the creak of old wood settling in an abandoned house. It wasn't a language I recognized, but the words. They crawled into my mind, burrowing deep, filling me with a sense of dread so profound that I thought I might lose my mind. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I remember the truck lurching forward, the figure disappearing into the fog, and the road stretching out endlessly before me. I drove without thinking, without feeling, the truck moving on its own, guided by some force I couldn't comprehend. When I finally came to, I was parked at a rest stop, miles away from the Sierra Negra. The sun was rising, and the fog had lifted, but the terror of what I had seen, what I had heard, lingered. My hands were still shaking, my mind reeling from the experience. I never drove through the Sierra Negra again after that. I couldn't. The memories of those nights, of the figure in the fog, haunted me. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, of that thing, that creature, coming for me, whispering those same incomprehensible words. I left the trucking business not long after. I couldn't bear the thought of being on the road again, of risking another encounter with whatever it was that haunted those mountains. I moved to a small town, far from any major highways, and tried to live a normal life. but the fear never left me. Even now, years later, I still hear that voice in my dreams, still see that figure standing in the fog, waiting, watching. I know it's still out there, waiting for the next poor soul who dares to venture into the Sierra Negra at night. And I know that one day it will find me again, because some things, once they've marked you, never let you go.